I'll imagine knowing a secret so explosive, so intimate, that it could shake an entire monarchy to its core. Now imagine you're the one person entrusted to keep that secret, the one standing in the shadow of royalty, privy to laughter behind closed doors, to tears no one else was meant to see. For centuries, the walls of palaces have stood not just as symbols of power, but as fortresses of silence. Those who serve within them are bound by an unspoken oath: protect the family, preserve the mystery, and never ever tell. But what happens when that silence is shattered? When someone from the inside decides the world deserves to know the truth? That's exactly what happened when a royal nanny, someone whose very job was built on discretion and devotion, picked up a pen and wrote a memoir. This wasn't just any tell-all. It was an act of defiance that sent shockwaves through the highest echelons of society. Imagine holding the childhood secrets of future kings and queens, the scraped knees, the hidden fears, the moments of raw humanity behind the polished public image, and then deciding to share them with the world. This nanny didn't just cross a line. She erased it, challenging centuries of tradition in one bold stroke. In this video, we're stepping inside one of history's most breathtaking breaches of trust. We'll explore why she did it, what she revealed, and how her words didn't just expose the lives of the privileged. They redefined the very relationship between the monarchy and the public. This is a story about power, loyalty, and the weight of silence. It's about what happens when a person decides that some truths are too important to keep hidden. So settle in, because we're about to lift the curtain on the royal nanny who wrote a memoir and change the way we see royalty forever. To understand the gravity of her decision, we must first understand the woman at the heart of this story. Her name was Marion Crawford, though history would come to know her by the affectionate nickname given to her by her most famous charges, Crawfie. She was not a product of the aristocratic elite or a courtier steeped in palace intrigue. Marion was a Scottish schoolteacher, a young woman from a modest background with a progressive education and a fervent belief in the value of outdoor activity and practical learning. She was, in many ways, the absolute antithesis of the staid, traditional environment of the royal household. Her entry into this rarefied world was almost accidental. In the early 1930s, she was working as a governess for the children of the Marquess of Clydesdale when she was recommended to the Duke and Duchess of York. At the time, the Yorks were considered the minor royals, living a relatively quiet life at 145 Piccadilly, far from the direct line of succession. They were seeking an educator for their two young daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. They weren't looking for a stern disciplinarian. They wanted someone who could provide a warm, nurturing, and somewhat normal upbringing. In Marion Crawford, they found their ideal candidate. Crawfie's initial role was revolutionary for its time. She took the princesses on the subway, allowed them to mix with other children at parties, and encouraged them to play outside and engage with the world beyond the palace gates. She was more than a governess. She was a constant, comforting presence, a confidante who witnessed their most unguarded moments. For 17 years, she shaped their days, taught them their lessons, and offered a shoulder to cry on. She was there for scraped knees, hidden giggles after bedtime, and the profound shock of their grandfather's death in their father's unexpected ascension to the throne as King George VI. Through the uncertainty of abdication and the terror of the Second World War, Crawford was a fixed point in their lives, a beloved and trusted member of the family. This deep, intimate bond built over nearly 2 decades is what made her eventual betrayal so personal and so explosive. The trust placed in her was absolute, which meant the breach of that trust would be felt as a profound and unforgivable act. Life inside the palace walls for Marion Crawford was a world of charming contradiction. Her days at 145 Piccadilly were not spent in the grand, echoing halls one might expect, but in a cozy nursery suite that felt, for a time, surprisingly like a normal home. Her charge was to educate 2 bright young girls, Princess Elizabeth and her younger sister Margaret, and she approached this task with a modern sensibility that was utterly foreign to the royal establishment. While the outside world saw the trappings of monarchy, Crawford's domain was one of chalkboards, storybooks, and the innocent chaos of childhood. She instituted a routine that balanced structure with freedom, a radical notion for princesses of that era. Mornings began with lessons where Crawford taught history, geography, and grammar, often tailoring the subjects to make them engaging for a future queen. But the afternoons were for adventure. She famously took the girls on unpublicized trips on the London Underground, where they would blend in with the public, into pantomimes and puppet shows where they could experience the simple joy of being ordinary children. She even convinced their parents to let them join other girls in a local troupe of girl guides, where they learned to tie knots and build fires alongside their peers, a level of integration that was almost unheard of. The heart of her life with the princesses, however, was found at Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park. This became their true sanctuary, a place where the formality of London life melted away. Here, Crawford's philosophy of outdoor education truly flourished. The girls were encouraged to dig in the garden, climb trees, and care for their own menagerie of pets, which included dogs, ponies, and even a pair of mischievous budgerigars. It was in these private moments that the most intimate bonds were forged. Crawford was there for whispered secrets after lights out, for comforting hugs after a nightmare, and for the shared, helpless laughter that comes from a private joke. She wasn't just their teacher. She was their playmate and their confidante, a steady and loving presence in their insular world. This idyllic existence was built on a foundation of mutual affection and deep trust from the entire family. The Duke and Duchess of York, particularly the future Queen Mother, valued Crawford's influence and welcomed her as part of their inner circle. She was privy to their unguarded conversations, their parental worries, and their hopes for their daughters' futures. She witnessed the quiet dignity of the Duke and the warm, social grace of the Duchess, seeing them not as distant icons, but as a devoted mother and father. This unparalleled access and the genuine closeness she shared with them all made her later actions not merely a professional transgression, but a profound and deeply personal betrayal of a family who had considered her one of their own. This cozy, almost ordinary existence was suddenly and irrevocably shattered in late 1936. The abdication of King Edward VIII was not merely a constitutional crisis. It was a devastating family earthquake that sent shockwaves directly into the heart of the York household. For the Duke and Duchess of York, It meant an unimaginable shift in destiny. The quiet, shy Duke, who had never expected nor desired the crown, was now King George VI. His wife was Queen Elizabeth, and their 10-year-old daughter, Lilibet, was no longer just a princess. She was the heir presumptive to the throne of England. The weight of an empire had descended upon their shoulders in an instant, and the family's private world of picnics and Girl Guide meetings was abruptly replaced by the relentless glare of the public eye. The atmosphere within the household transformed from one of relaxed affection to one of solemn duty and palpable anxiety. Crawford watched as the new king, struggling with a debilitating stammer and a deep-seated reluctance to lead, was thrust into a role that consumed him. The new queen, now tasked with bolstering a nervous monarch and a reeling nation, provided unwavering support, but carried the immense strain herself. The walls of their home, once a shelter, now felt like a fortress under siege by press and public expectation. For the two young girls at the center of this storm, the change was both confusing and profound. Their father was suddenly a distant, preoccupied figure weighed down by state papers, and their mother was the busy, graceful center of a new and intimidating court. Their familiar life had vanished. In the midst of this upheaval, Marion Crawford's role became more critical than ever. She was tasked with an almost impossible mission: to provide an island of normalcy in a rising sea of ceremony and stress. While the world outside changed beyond recognition, inside the schoolroom, Crawford fought to keep the routine intact. Lessons continued. Grammar and history were still taught. The beloved afternoons at Royal Lodge, now more guarded and private, remained a sacred time for outdoor play and fresh air. Crawford became the girls' anchor, the one constant in a universe that had been turned upside down. She offered a familiar face and a reassuring presence when their parents were inevitably absorbed by the crushing demands of their new positions. She also became their interpreter, gently explaining the bewildering new realities of their lives. It was Crawford who helped Lilibet understand the weight of the destiny that now lay before her, framing it not as a burden, but as a form of service she was uniquely equipped to handle. She witnessed the moment the young heir presumptive, with a seriousness beyond her years, began to consciously practice the regal wave from a window, understanding intuitively that her private life was now a public performance. For the more spirited Margaret, Crawford provided an outlet for frustration and a source of comfort when she felt overshadowed by her sister's new importance. In this period of intense transition, the royal nanny was far more than an employee. She was a stabilizer, a counselor, and the chief defender of what little childhood the princesses had left, proving her indispensable value to a family navigating the most disorienting chapter of their lives. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 transformed the royal family's life of duty into one of tangible danger, and Marion Crawford's role evolved from educator to protector in the most literal sense. The idyllic days at Royal Lodge were over, replaced by the formidable, ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle, chosen as a safer refuge for the princesses than central London. This was not a grand royal relocation, but a strategic retreat for survival. The castle, with its thick medieval walls, became both a fortress and a prison, a world away from the carefree outings on the underground that had once defined their routine. Crawford now had to create a sense of normalcy within a structure that echoed with the grim reality of a nation at war. Life inside the castle was a strange mixture of the ordinary and the extraordinary. The princess's education continued relentlessly, with Crawford ensuring that algebra and history were diligently studied, even as air raid sirens wailed outside. But the classroom now had a new, terrifying feature: a bomb shelter. Crawford would usher the girls into these reinforced rooms, their lessons often continuing by the dim light of a lantern, the sounds of anti-aircraft guns providing a dissonant backdrop to grammar exercises. She became an expert in maintaining a calm and composed demeanor, understanding that her own reaction would directly influence theirs. Her greatest responsibility was to be a pillar of unshakable calm in a world that was literally shaking around them. The emotional toll of the separation from their parents was immense. King George and Queen Elizabeth made the difficult decision to remain at Buckingham Palace, a symbol of defiance that also made them a target. Crawford was now the sole parental figure present for long stretches, tasked with comforting the princesses through fears of air raids and anxieties for their mother and father's safety. She was there to reassure them after the palace itself was bombed, transforming a traumatic event into a story of shared resilience with the people of London. She masterfully framed the war not as a terrifying abstraction, but as a shared national effort in which they all had a part to play, from growing vegetables in the castle's garden to knitting socks for soldiers. Crawford's ingenuity was constantly tested in preserving the girls' emotional well-being. She organized pantomimes and plays, turning the castle's long galleries into makeshift theaters to keep their spirits high. She encouraged their radio broadcasts to the children of the empire, helping Princess Elizabeth, in particular, find her voice and understand the comforting power of her presence. In these years, Crawford was far more than a governess. She was a shield against fear, an architect of childhood joy in a time of overwhelming darkness, and the steady hand that guided the future queen through the most formative and frightening years of her life. Her success in this immense task only deepened the bond of trust, making the king and queen forever grateful and cementing her position not as staff, but as family. Yet for all this intimacy and trust, Marion Crawford's position after the war was one of quiet, growing isolation. As Princess Elizabeth grew into her role as heir, marrying Philip Mountbatten and starting her own family, the need for a governess naturally faded. Crawford found herself increasingly on the periphery of the world she had devoted her life to. The king and queen, eternally grateful, provided her with a grace and favor home, Nottingham Cottage, on the grounds of Kensington Palace. It was a generous pension, a token of thanks for her years of service, but it was also a gentle push into retirement, a life of comfortable obscurity that, for a woman who had been at the center of such momentous events, perhaps felt more like a gilded cage. It was into this void of quiet irrelevance that the offer came. In the late 1940s, an American magazine editor from the Ladies' Home Journal named John Miller began a persistent courtship. He had heard whispers of the beloved Crawford and recognized an untold story of immense public appeal. His initial letters were flattering, emphasizing the public's deep affection for the young princesses and their desire to know more about their childhood. He painted the project not as a salacious tell-all, but as a warm human interest story, a tribute to the family she so clearly adored. For a woman living on a fixed income, the financial incentive he dangled was also undoubtedly life-changing, a sum reported to be in the tens of thousands of dollars, an astronomical amount at the time. Crawford's initial reaction was one of profound hesitation and outright refusal. The code of confidentiality was not a mere rule to her. It was a part of her very identity, woven into the fabric of the 17 years she had given. She had been the keeper of secrets, the guardian of the private world. To violate that was to violate her own deepest sense of loyalty. She reportedly wrote back refusing the offer, stating her unwavering devotion to the family. But John Miller was a skilled negotiator who understood human vulnerability. He patiently continued his campaign, reframing the proposal, assuring her that the portrait would be nothing but positive, a chance to show the world the wonderful upbringing of the future queen. This gentle, persistent pressure found its mark on a woman at a crossroads. Sitting in her small cottage, separated from the daily life of the palace, she may have felt that her unique story, her contribution, was fading into nothingness. The offer represented not just money, but a form of recognition, a chance to cement her own place in a history from which she was being gently erased. It was a tragic miscalculation, a belief that she could control the narrative and that her affection for the family would shine through any publication. After a long period of internal struggle, she made a fateful decision. She would write the story, but she would show the manuscript to the palace for their approval first. A clause she believed would protect her and them, a final, desperate attempt to have both her loyalty and her legacy. It was a compromise that would satisfy no one and ignite the very fire she hoped to control. And so, with a mix of trepidation and a flicker of excitement, Marion Crawford embarked on a project shrouded in secrecy, a stark contrast to the open devotion that had defined her life. Her first and most formidable challenge was the physical act of writing itself. Living in a grace and favor home on the royal estate meant she was never truly free from the possibility of prying eyes. Every word she put to paper was a potential landmine, and she knew that if the palace discovered her project prematurely, it would be swiftly and decisively shut down. This necessitated a level of clandestine operation that must have felt utterly alien to a woman who had built her career on transparency and trust. Her writing process became a series of furtive, stolen moments. The manuscript was not drafted in the open at a desk, but was likely scribbled in notebooks secreted away in drawers, written late into the night when she could be certain of her solitude. She had to rely entirely on her own remarkable memory, for consulting any official diaries, letters, or photographs from her time as governess would have been far too great a risk. Every anecdote, every recalled conversation, every intimate detail about the princess's childhood had to be pulled from the depths of her mind, a 17-year trove of memories now being carefully curated for public consumption. One can only imagine the internal whiplash of switching from the mindset of a loyal guardian to that of a memoirist, mentally replaying private moments of tenderness and converting them into narrative prose for a mass audience. The logistics of dealing with her American publishers, the Curtis Brown Agency, and the Ladies' Home Journal required even greater deception. Secret meetings were arranged not at her home, but in anonymous London hotel rooms or quiet corners of restaurants, places where she was unlikely to be recognized by anyone from the court. These encounters with editors like John Miller would have been charged with a nervous energy. She was now a co-conspirator in the unveiling of the very world she was sworn to protect, discussing royalties and serialization rights over tea, a universe away from discussing lessons in palace protocol. The need for this covert planning highlights the profound dissonance at the heart of her actions. She was treating the most trusted relationship of her life as a corporate secret to be managed. Throughout this entire process, the weight of her decision must have been a constant, gnawing presence. Each sentence she wrote was a small betrayal. Recalling the young Elizabeth's earnestness or Margaret's mischievous grin for a commercial audience likely triggered pangs of guilt. She clung to the rationalization that she was writing a loving tribute, a positive portrait that would only increase public affection for the family. This was the fragile shield she used against her own conscience, convincing herself that her affection for the girls would be evident on every page and would therefore excuse the fundamental breach of protocol. In a tragic miscalculation, she even believed that her old-fashioned sense of courtesy would see her through. She fully intended to submit the finished manuscript to the palace for their approval, a gesture she saw as respectful, but which they would inevitably view as an unspeakable affront. She was navigating a moral gray area, blind to the fact that from the perspective of the monarchy, there were no shades of gray, only black and white, loyalty and disloyalty. The very act of writing was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. The publication of The Little Princesses in 1950 did not arrive with a whisper, but with a thunderclap that reverberated across the Atlantic and crashed into the gates of Buckingham Palace with devastating force. While the serialization ran in the Ladies' Home Journal in America, the contents quickly found their way back to Britain, landing like a bomb in the middle of the royal family's carefully maintained world. The initial reaction within the palace walls was not one of anger, but of sheer, disbelieving betrayal. This was not the warm, sanctioned tribute Crawford had perhaps deluded herself into believing she was writing. To the family, it was a fundamental violation, a peephole into their most private sanctuary cut open by the one person they had trusted implicitly to guard the door. The depth of the hurt was profoundly personal, especially for Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. She had not just been Crawford's employer, she had been her friend and champion, a woman who had shared her deepest parental joys and fears with her. To see those private moments, the quiet conversations, the childhood anxieties, the intimate family jokes, now packaged and sold for international consumption, was an act of treachery that cut to the bone. The Queen Mother was reported to be deeply wounded and personally disappointed, a sentiment that carried immense weight coming from a figure known for her steadfast grace and unwavering loyalty. The betrayal was seen as a stain on the king's own reign, a private humiliation for a man already burdened by the immense stress of his office and his fragile health. The family's trust, given so completely for so long, had been commodified. The official response from the palace was swift, absolute, and icily cold. There were no fiery public statements or legal threats. The monarchy's power lies in its silence and its presence. The punishment was administered through a policy of complete and permanent ostracization. Marion Crawford was immediately and irrevocably cut off. The grace and favor home she occupied was understood to be a lifetime gift, and she was not evicted, but it became a very beautiful prison. Invitations to all royal events ceased utterly. The telephone lines that once connected her directly to the family went dead. Former colleagues and members of the royal household were instructed to have no contact with her, a social exile that was both comprehensive and humiliating. She was, for all intents and purposes, declared dead to the family she had served. This chilling silence was the most powerful message the institution could send. It communicated that Crawford was no longer considered a misguided former servant, but a non-person. Her name was never to be mentioned in royal circles again. This reaction was not merely about punishment. It was a crucial act of damage control. By treating her with absolute contempt, the palace set a brutal precedent for anyone else who might be tempted to follow in her footsteps. It reinforced the ancient rule of the royal court: loyalty is absolute, and disloyalty is unforgivable. The message to every staff member, from the highest equerry to the lowest footman, was crystal clear. This is the price of breaking the code. The royal family closed ranks with an impenetrable solidarity, presenting a unified, silent front to the world, while behind the scenes, they nursed the personal agony of a friendship shattered beyond repair. The public's reaction to Crawford's book was nothing short of a media earthquake. In the United States, where the Ladies' Home Journal first serialized the story, the response was a frenzy of excitement. Americans, with their more democratic sensibilities and appetite for celebrity, devoured every intimate detail. The magazine flew off the newsstands, with sales figures soaring into the millions. Readers were captivated by the charming, humanizing anecdotes. The young Princess Elizabeth carefully saving her ration coupons to buy a wedding gift for her father. The mischievous Princess Margaret painting her knees with gravy to pretend she had scraped them. The quiet family evenings spent playing card games. For a world still emerging from the shadow of war, these glimpses into the childhood of a beloved future queen were not seen as a betrayal, but as a heartwarming affirmation of a family's normality amidst extraordinary circumstances. The publisher, John Miller, had been proven right. The public's hunger for this story was insatiable. Across the Atlantic in Britain, however, the reception was profoundly more complex and sharply divided. When the book arrived in British shops, it became an immediate and massive bestseller, proving that the appetite for royal insight was just as strong at home. Yet the conversation surrounding it was laced with a palpable sense of unease and moral judgment. The British press played a fascinating dual role, simultaneously fueling the frenzy by publishing extensive excerpts and front-page headlines, while also serving as the moral arbiter of the nation. Many editorials and opinion pieces expressed outright condemnation, framing Crawford's actions as a gross breach of trust and a shameful act of disloyalty. The establishment, including politicians and social commentators, largely sided with the palace, viewing the memoir as a tawdry descent into commercial exploitation that undermined the dignity of the crown. This created a fascinating schism between the official narrative of outrage and the private actions of the public. While people might have clucked their tongues in disapproval at the bridge table or written letters to newspapers criticizing the tell-all, they were still eagerly buying the book and reading every word. There was a collective sense of curiosity that ultimately outweighed the sense of propriety for many ordinary citizens. They wanted to know what the princess's nursery looked like, what they ate for breakfast, how their parents disciplined them. Crawford had provided a key to a door that had always been locked, and despite their better judgment, countless people could not resist the urge to turn that key and peek inside. This divide highlighted a shifting relationship with the monarchy. The public still revered the institution, but a modern desire for a more relatable, accessible royalty was beginning to emerge, whether the establishment was ready for it or not. The media frenzy itself was relentless. Paparazzi, a breed of journalist then in its infancy, camped outside Marion Crawford's grace and favor home, shouting questions and hoping for a comment or a photograph. Newspaper editors commissioned follow-up stories, analyzing every sentence of the book for hidden meanings or additional scandals. Cartoonists lampooned her, depicting her as a jilted spinster counting her pieces of silver. She was given a new, unshakable moniker in the press, the Royal Tattler. This constant attention, which she had so naively failed to anticipate, transformed her life from one of quiet retirement into a gilded nightmare. She was now a household name, but for all the wrong reasons, trapped in the glare of a spotlight she had helped to switch on, and isolated from the very world that could have offered her protection from it. The book's success had made her a wealthy woman, but it had also made her a pariah, caught between a public that consumed her story and an establishment that despised her for telling it. So what exactly was inside these pages that caused such an uproar? The power of Crawford's book lay not in a single shocking scandal, but in 1,000 tiny, intimate cuts. She didn't reveal state secrets or political conspiracies. She dismantled the myth of the monarchy by exposing its utterly human heart. For the first time, the public was invited not to gaze upon distant icons on a balcony, but to peek through the keyhole of the nursery door. She detailed the princess's daily routine with a granularity that felt breathtakingly personal. Readers learned that Princess Elizabeth, the future queen, was a meticulous and serious child who lovingly cared for her collection of 30 toy horses, brushing their manes and arranging them in precise order. Her sister Margaret, by contrast, was portrayed as a vivacious, mischievous, and often difficult imp, the spoiled darling of the family who once threw a tantrum so fierce she kicked a hole in a castle wall. Crawford painted vivid portraits of their parents, moving them from stoic figures on postage stamps to relatable, sometimes flawed, human beings. She described King George VI not as a majestic sovereign, but as a sometimes irritable and anxious father, a man who could be reduced to frustrated silence by his stammer and who cherished the quiet order of family life. The Queen Mother emerged as the warm, social, and fiercely protective matriarch, the anchor of the family, but also a mother who openly displayed her favoritism towards the younger, more entertaining Margaret. This was a radical departure from the curated, formal image the palace projected. Crawford showed the king enjoying a simple boiled egg for breakfast, the queen meticulously checking the household accounts, and the two of them spending quiet evenings doing jigsaw puzzles, domestic scenes that were utterly ordinary, and for that very reason, utterly revolutionary when applied to a royal family. Perhaps the most explosive revelations were those that dealt with the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, tensions within the family unit. Crawford's narrative highlighted the starkly different treatment of the two sisters, a dynamic that would shape their relationship for decades. Elizabeth was constantly prepared for duty, her every action viewed through the lens of her future role. Margaret, unburdened by such expectations, was indulged and allowed to be the family's entertainer. Crawford wrote of the lonely weight on the young heir's shoulders and the simmering resentment that could occasionally bubble up from the perpetually overshadowed spare. She detailed private moments of parental doubt and worry, showing the king and queen not as infallible leaders, but as a mother and father grappling with the impossible task of raising one daughter to rule a nation while allowing the other to simply have a childhood. The book's true transgression was its methodical humanization. Crawford told of Lilibet carefully saving her clothing ration coupons to buy material for her wedding dress, a poignant detail that connected her to every other British bride-making do in the austere post-war years. She described the princesses taking baths in a few inches of water to comply with wartime conservation efforts and helping to dig up the lawns of Windsor Castle to plant vegetable patches. These were not the acts of aloof aristocrats, but of a family participating in the shared struggle of their people. By pulling back the crimson curtain, Marion Crawford didn't just share stories. She dismantled the divine right of kings and replaced it with the image of a father reading bedtime stories, a mother fretting over a child's cough, and two sisters squabbling over a toy. She made them real, and in doing so, she fundamentally challenged the mystique that the crown relied upon to maintain its power and distance. The establishment's fury was not because she lied, but because she told the truth, and that truth was far more dangerous than any fiction. The unwritten rules Crawford shattered were not mere guidelines. They were the very bedrock of the royal household, an ancient and unshakable code of silence known as the Golden Circle of Trust. For centuries, this was an absolute principle. Those who served inside the palace walls were invisible guardians, their loyalty measured by their silence. Their privilege of access was paid for with a lifetime of discretion, a vow so ingrained it was more instinct than instruction. They were the human vaults for the monarchy's most precious asset, its mystique. This mystique wasn't just about grandeur. It was a carefully constructed shield of privacy that allowed the royal family to maintain their symbolic power, separate from the messy realities of everyday human emotion. By pulling back that curtain, Marion Crawford didn't just break a rule. She attacked the foundation of the institution itself. The specific protocols she violated were both practical and profoundly symbolic. The most sacred was the absolute prohibition against ever publicly commenting on the royal family, either during service or, most importantly, after. Staff, especially those in the inner circle, were expected to take their stories to the grave. Diaries were forbidden for those in sensitive positions, and personal photographs of the family were strictly controlled. Conversations overheard, private jokes shared, personal struggles witnessed, these were not anecdotes. They were state secrets. Crawford's detailed accounts of the king's struggles with his temper and his stammer, or the Queen Mother's clear favoritism toward Margaret, were seen as the deepest form of treachery because they exposed vulnerability. The monarchy's public image was one of unwavering strength and unity. Her memoir revealed the private doubts and familial tensions that made them human, thereby diminishing their symbolic power. Her transgression was compounded by her unique position. A low-ranking footman might glimpse a fragment of life, but a governess, particularly one embedded with the family for 17 years, saw the entire tapestry. She wasn't staff in the traditional sense. She was a hybrid figure, a paid employee who had been welcomed into the emotional intimacy of the family unit. She had been invited to Christmas celebrations, had comforted the children during parental absences, and had been a confidante to the parents themselves. This blurring of the lines between servant and surrogate family made her betrayal feel infinitely more personal. She wasn't just an employee leaking secrets. She was a friend selling out her friends, a godmother revealing her godchildren's insecurities to the world. The royal family had given her the highest currency they possessed, their trust, and she had spent it. The reaction from the establishment was so severe precisely because her actions threatened the entire system. If Crawford, the beloved and trusted Crawford, could be tempted by a publisher's check, then no one was safe. The palace's brutal and total ostracization was a necessary public execution, a message to every current and future member of the household: see what happens to those who talk. This precedent was crucial for maintaining control. It reinforced that the bond of silence was non-negotiable, a lifetime commitment that extended far beyond the end of employment. In the eyes of the court, Marion Crawford committed the ultimate sin. She prioritized her own story and financial gain over the sanctity of the institution she had sworn to protect. And in doing so, she forever redefined the boundary between a royal servant's duty and their individuality. The comfortable retirement Marion Crawford had envisioned in her grace and favor home at Nottingham Cottage quickly curdled into a life of profound and permanent isolation. The royal family's reaction was not a temporary cold shoulder or a formal reprimand. It was a complete and utter severing of ties, executed with the quiet, devastating finality that only an ancient institution can muster. One day, she was Crawford, a beloved figure from the past. The next, she was a non-person, a ghost in the meticulously kept gardens of Kensington Palace. The telephone, which had once rung with invitations or warm check-ins, fell silent. The familiar handwriting of the palace staff on correspondence ceased to appear in her mailbox. The invisible cord that had connected her to the world she had served for most of her adult life was not just cut, it was evaporated. This social exile was absolute and enforced at every level. Former colleagues and friends within the royal household were given a clear, unspoken directive. Marion Crawford was to be avoided. Any contact would be seen as a profound disloyalty to the crown. The very people she had taken tea with for years, those who had shared in the struggles and joys of wartime service, now crossed the street to avoid her. She was a pariah, a walking cautionary tale. The punishment was also deeply symbolic. While she was not technically evicted from Nottingham Cottage, the gift was understood to be for her lifetime. The home became a gilded cage, a constant reminder of the world that was now forever beyond her reach. She lived on the grounds of the kingdom, but was no longer a citizen of it. The public humiliation compounded her private shame. The British press, which had voraciously consumed her story, now turned on her with moralistic fury. They christened her with the name that would haunt her for the rest of her days, the Royal Tattler. Cartoonists depicted her as a greedy spinster, counting her 30 pieces of silver. She became a staple of gossip columns, a figure of ridicule and scorn. The very fame she had perhaps naively sought now felt like a relentless, inescapable glare. Paparazzi camped outside her home, not to celebrate her, but to capture the image of a woman living in the consequences of her own actions. The financial security the book provided was a hollow consolation, a fortune that served as a constant reminder of the priceless things she had lost: her place, her purpose, and her identity. In a heartbreaking final attempt at reconciliation, Crawford made a fateful miscalculation. Believing the warmth of her affection in the book would eventually soften the family's stance, she sent a copy of The Little Princesses as a Christmas present to the Queen Mother. This gesture, intended as an olive branch, was received as the deepest possible insult. To send the very instrument of betrayal as a festive gift was seen as a stunning act of poor taste and further proof that Crawford fundamentally did not understand the gravity of what she had done. There was no acknowledgement, no thank you note, only a chilling, reinforced silence that made the message unmistakably clear. There would be no forgiveness, no second chances. The door, once open to her for 17 years, was now not just closed, but bricked over. Marion Crawford had traded her unique place in the inner circle of history for a check and a lifetime of regret, forever exiled from the royal favor she had once held so dear. Cast out from the only world she had ever truly known, Marion Crawford now faced an impossible question. What does one do after committing the unforgivable? The substantial payment from her memoir was a financial life raft, but it could not provide a purpose. Isolated in her Kensington Palace cottage and haunted by the silence from the institution next door, she made a fateful and ultimately tragic decision. If she was already branded a tell-all author, then perhaps she could build a new identity as a professional writer, a respected commentator on the very world that had exiled her. This desperate attempt to forge a post-palace career would lead her straight into the arms of the burgeoning women's magazine industry, a move that only deepened her disgrace and proved the long, inescapable reach of royal displeasure. Her first and most significant opportunity came from Woman's Day, a popular weekly magazine eager to capitalize on her infamous notoriety. They offered her a regular column, a platform from which she could ostensibly share her insights on parenting, childhood education, and domestic life, all topics she was genuinely qualified to discuss given her 17 years of experience. But everyone involved knew the real draw was the faint, tantalizing hope that she might let another royal anecdote slip, that the byline, by Marion Crawford, was a silent promise of privileged access. For a brief period, she tried to walk this impossible tightrope, writing generic, wholesome advice that was a pale shadow of her lived expertise. She penned pieces on managing pocket money and the importance of fresh air, all while consciously avoiding any mention of the two most famous children she had ever raised. The column was hollow, a performance devoid of its main attraction, and both the editors and the readers could feel the glaring absence at its heart. The reality was that the royal family's displeasure was not a passive emotion. It was an active, powerful force within the British media establishment. While the palace never issued a formal, public edict against her, The message was communicated in the subtle, unshakable ways of the British class system. Editors and publishers understood that to be seen as providing a platform for that woman was to risk their own access and standing. An invitation to a palace garden party, a coveted background briefing from a press secretary, a sanctioned photograph. All of these professional perks could vanish for a publication that dared to employ the royal family's greatest betrayer. This created an invisible but impermeable glass ceiling for Crawford's new career. She was too toxic for the high-end publications that valued their royal connections, and too ordinary for the tabloids that only wanted salacious revelations she was either unwilling or unable to provide. Her attempts to pivot to other subjects were met with indifference. She proposed articles on Scottish history and the importance of education, but editors, remembering the public's harsh judgment, showed little interest. The very name Marion Crawford had become synonymous with one thing: disloyalty. She was a box set, a one-hit wonder, and the market had no appetite for her other work. The few pieces that were published were often framed with a sneering tone, the magazines themselves participating in the collective punishment by subtly reminding their readers of the author's controversial past, even as they paid her for her copy. This period of her life was a cruel paradox. She was simultaneously famous and irrelevant, a household name who had nothing left to say that anyone wanted to hear. The career she had hoped would redeem her instead became a constant public reminder of her fall from grace, a daily exercise in trying to build something substantial on the quicksand of her own ruined reputation. Cut off from the royal world and finding no solace in her attempted writing career, Marion Crawford sought a different kind of escape: marriage. In 1952, she wed George Buthley, a retired bank manager she had known for many years. On the surface, this union represented a chance at a normal, quiet life, a reset button she desperately wanted to press. She moved north to Aberdeen, Scotland, to be with him, trading the gilded cage of Kensington Palace for a modest semi-detached house in a suburban neighborhood. It was a dramatic physical and social descent, from the epicenter of British power to a life of profound ordinariness. Yet, this change of scenery could not provide the fresh start she craved, for the shadow of her past was inescapable. George Buthley, by all accounts, was a difficult and domineering man, and their marriage was far from the happy refuge she might have hoped for. Friends and neighbors later described him as controlling and deeply impressed by the idea of his wife's former status, yet simultaneously bitter about the social limitations her notoriety imposed on them. He was often referred to as the major factor behind her decision to write the memoir, with many believing he had encouraged her to accept the American offer for the substantial financial gain it promised. If this was true, then life with George Buthley became a constant, living reminder of the choice that had led to her exile. Rather than a partner offering comfort, he may have been a walking reproach, a symbol of the worldly motives that had overruled her loyalty. The social isolation she experienced in London followed her to Aberdeen. In a conservative Scottish city, her reputation as the royal tattler preceded her. She was not welcomed into the local social circles. Instead, she was met with curiosity laced with judgment. Neighbors would watch her from behind their net curtains, but invitations for tea were scarce. The very thing that made her fascinating, her intimate knowledge of the royal family, was also the reason she was shunned. She had broken a sacred code, and in a society that valued propriety and discretion, this was a sin that could not be forgiven. She and George lived a life of quiet, lonely respectability, their existence a world away from the vibrant, purposeful life she had once known within the royal household. The most poignant and undeniable evidence of her profound regret emerged in a series of actions that spoke louder than any words could. In a desperate attempt to atone, she tried to donate the entire proceeds from her book to charity, a clear signal that the money brought her no pleasure, only guilt. She was reportedly told by the palace that it was too late for such gestures, the damage was done, and no amount of money could repair it. This rejection of her attempted penance must have been a devastating blow, final confirmation that her path back to redemption was permanently closed. In her later years, plagued by ill health and depression, her remorse became ever more visible. She reportedly kept a photograph of the Queen Mother on her mantelpiece, a silent tribute to the friendship she had lost. Visitors described a deeply sad and lonely woman who would often talk about the princesses, referring to them still as "my little girls," with a palpable sense of longing and loss. The memories that had been her commodity were now her prison. The book that was meant to cement her legacy had instead erased her true self, replacing the devoted Crawford with the infamous Marion Crawford, the woman who betrayed a king. She lived long enough to see the young princess she had nurtured become the revered sovereign, Elizabeth II, a constant and glorious reminder of the world she was once part of and had forever lost. Her story ends not with a sense of victory or vindication, but with the quiet, tragic weight of a life lived in the long, cold shadow of a single, irredeemable mistake. While Marion Crawford's breach of trust felt like an unprecedented earthquake within the monarchy, she was not, in fact, the first servant to put pen to paper. The history of royal households is punctuated by tell-alls, though they were rarely so intimate or so devastating. For centuries, the most common accounts came from diplomats, courtiers, or foreign visitors, outsiders observing the pomp and ceremony from a privileged but still distant vantage point. Their writings often focused on political machinations, the grandeur of court life, or the character of a monarch as a ruler, not as a parent. A valet might detail his king's dressing routine, or a chambermaid might gossip about a queen's temper. But these revelations were typically about figures who were already public property, their personal quirks adding color to their official personas. What set Crawford's account apart, and what made it so uniquely damaging, was the nature of her relationship with her subjects and the era in which she wrote. She was not a servant who polished silver or arranged flowers. She was a surrogate family member who had been entrusted with the most vulnerable members of the dynasty, its children. Her memoir, The Little Princesses, didn't reveal state secrets. It revealed childhood secrets. In the austere post-war period, the British monarchy had carefully rebuilt its image around the ideal of the model family, a bastion of stability, morality, and quiet dedication. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth were portrayed as the nation's parents, and their two young daughters symbolized hope and continuity for the future. Crawford's book took a chisel to this perfectly sculpted public image by exposing the utterly ordinary and sometimes flawed humanity behind it. This was a far greater threat to the institution than any political scandal. A political scandal can be weathered with resignations and reforms, but revealing that the heir to the throne threw tantrums over her math lessons, or that the king could be short-tempered at breakfast, or that the queen mother openly played favorites, struck at the very heart of the monarchical mystique. The monarchy's power relies on a carefully maintained balance of being both symbolically elevated and sympathetically relatable. Crawford's account tilted this balance too far toward the relatable, making the family seem commonplace at a time when they needed to be seen as exceptional. She commercialized their private jokes, their domestic squabbles, and their parental anxieties, turning sacred family memories into supermarket gossip. Her transgression was also a product of its time, magnified by the burgeoning power of the transatlantic media. Previous royal servants who wrote memoirs did so in an age of slower news cycles and less intrusive media. Crawford's story was serialized in a massive American magazine, ensuring immediate and global dissemination. The post-war era also saw a rising demand for celebrity journalism and a growing public appetite for peeking behind the curtains of the elite. She became a pioneer in a new, more invasive form of royal coverage, blurring the line between dignified interest and prurient curiosity. In doing so, she didn't just break a confidence. She broke the ancient contract between the sovereign and those who serve in the inner sanctum, proving that no one, not even the most trusted governess, was immune to the temptations of the modern world. Her actions forced the palace to radically tighten its protocols, creating the fiercely guarded media management strategy that defines the royal household to this day, all because one woman decided the world needed to know about a little girl's toy horses. The Crawford scandal served as a deafening wake-up call for the monarchy, a stark revelation that the greatest threats to their privacy were not the paparazzi lurking outside the gates, but the trusted faces within them. For centuries, the royal household had operated on a foundation of unspoken honor and genteel discretion, a system that presumed loyalty was its own reward. Marion Crawford's betrayal proved that presumption was a dangerous anachronism in the modern age of lucrative publishing deals and insatiable media appetites. In the aftermath, the palace machinery, which had always moved with the quiet grace of tradition, was forced to grind into a new, more defensive gear. The response was not merely a reaction to one disloyal governess. It was a comprehensive institutional overhaul designed to ensure such a breach could never happen again. The most immediate and visible change was the formalization of silence. The old world gentleman's agreement was replaced with the cold, legal certainty of the non-disclosure agreement. Or a handshake and a sense of duty had once sufficed. Now there were binding contracts, thick with legal jargon and staggering financial penalties. Every new employee, from the highest-ranking private secretary to the most junior kitchen maid, was required to sign these documents, legally swearing themselves to a lifetime of secrecy. These agreements were not limited to their period of employment, but extended indefinitely, covering everything they might ever see, hear, or intuit during their time in royal service. The message was clear. Entering royal service was not just taking a job. It was accepting a lifelong vow of silence, enforceable by law and the full weight of the crown's resources. This created a powerful deterrent. making the cost of betrayal not just social exile, but financial ruin. Alongside this legal fortress came a revolution in the vetting process itself. The old methods of hiring through aristocratic connections or personal recommendations were deemed insufficiently rigorous. In their place, the palace instituted a security screening process of unprecedented depth and intrusiveness, conducted in coordination with external agencies. Potential staff now faced background checks that delved into their financial history, their personal relationships, and any potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited by the press. The question was no longer just, are you qualified, but are you impervious to temptation? This new protocol aimed to identify not just competence, but character, seeking individuals whose discretion was as much a part of their DNA as their professional skills. It was a shift from trusting people on principle to trusting them only after proving they were beyond reproach. Beyond the legal and procedural changes, a profound cultural shift permeated the royal household. The easy, almost familial camaraderie that Crawford had enjoyed was systematically dismantled and replaced with a more rigid, professional hierarchy. Staff were gently but firmly discouraged from forming the kind of deep, personal bonds with members of the royal family that could lead to a sense of ownership over private moments. The nursery, once a realm of shared laughter and confidences, became a more structured environment. While nannies and governesses were still expected to be kind and caring, the boundary between employee and family was reinforced with unmissable clarity. Trust was no longer given freely as a default. It became something that was earned slowly, incrementally, and could be revoked in an instant. The palace became a place of warmer walls and colder protocols, where everyone understood that their primary role was to protect the institution, a duty that now trumped any personal affection. This new fortress mentality extended far beyond the staff to reshape the very architecture of the princes' and princesses' childhoods. The charming, if naive, outings Crawford had orchestrated, the trips on the tube, the mixing with other girl guides, became unthinkable relics of a bygone era. Security details became a constant, invisible presence, and the children's world became increasingly insular, carefully curated within the confines of royal estates. The press office, once a relatively small operation, expanded its role dramatically, evolving into a sophisticated media management machine dedicated to controlling the narrative and feeding the public carefully sanitized, approved glimpses of royal life. Their task was to manufacture the appearance of accessibility while fiercely guarding the reality of privacy, a delicate balancing act born directly from the need to prevent another insider from deciding the public had a right to know. In the end, the legacy of Marion Crawford was not just her book, but the impregnable wall of silence that was built in its shadow, a wall that would define the childhood of every royal heir for generations to come. To truly grasp why Marion Crawford made a choice that seems so unthinkable, we have to look beyond simple greed or disloyalty and into the complex psychological crossroads where she found herself in the late 1940s. After nearly 2 decades at the very heart of the royal family, she was suddenly adrift, a central character abruptly written out of the story. Her identity, for so long defined by the daily rhythms of the nursery and the smiles of her little girls, was now reduced to a quiet existence in a small cottage. This profound loss of purpose is a critical piece of the puzzle. For 17 years, her life had immense meaning. She was shaping a future queen. Overnight, she became just another retired employee, a person whose greatest value was now part of the past. This kind of sudden insignificance can create a deep, psychological void, a desperate need to prove that one's life still matters. Financial anxiety almost certainly played a powerful role in her calculations. While she lived in a grace and favor home, it was not a lavish pension. She was a single woman entering her later years with a fixed and modest income, facing a future of financial constraint. The offer from the Ladies' Home Journal represented not just wealth, but security, a chance to escape the quiet worry of making ends meet for the rest of her life. For someone from a modest Scottish background, the sum offered was utterly transformative, a life-changing fortune that promised comfort and independence. It's easy to judge from the outside, but the temptation to secure one's future, especially after a lifetime of service, can cloud one's judgment about the ethical cost. The money wasn't just for luxuries. It represented freedom from fear, a powerful motivator for anyone facing an uncertain retirement. Yet to attribute her actions solely to money is to overlook a more profound and perhaps more human driver, a deep-seated hunger for recognition. Crawford had been the silent architect of a royal childhood, the unseen hand behind the poised young women the public adored. She possessed a unique and intimate history, and the idea that it would simply vanish with her must have been agonizing. The book offer presented a tantalizing opportunity to cement her own legacy, to step out of the shadows and finally receive credit for the role she had played. She likely convinced herself that she was writing a tribute, a loving account that would show the world the wonderful family she served, and by extension, her own indispensable part in it. This wasn't necessarily a malicious desire for fame, but a tragic yearning to be seen and remembered as more than just the help. Beneath this likely simmered a feeling of being undervalued, a resentment that may have grown slowly in her final years of service. She had given her entire youth to the family, postponing marriage and a life of her own. She had been their rock through an abdication in a world war, yet her retirement, while comfortable, might have felt like a surprisingly casual farewell for such devoted service. The human heart is complex. Immense affection can coexist with a nagging sense that one's sacrifices have not been fully appreciated. Writing the book could have been a subconscious act of setting the record straight, a way of shouting, "I was here, I mattered." This need to assert her own value, to claim a piece of the history she helped create, ultimately overruled a lifetime of ingrained discretion. Finally, we must consider the possibility of a simple, catastrophic misjudgment. Marion Crawford was a school teacher from a middle-class background, not a courtier born into the nuances of royal protocol. She fundamentally failed to comprehend the seismic difference between a family's private life and the monarchy's public mystique. In her mind, she was sharing charming stories about children she loved. In the institution's view, she was dismantling a centuries-old foundation of power based on privacy and separation. Her tragic error was in believing her unique intimacy granted her ownership over those memories, when in the eyes of the crown, those memories were never hers to share. She saw a heartwarming human interest story. The palace saw an existential threat. This profound failure to understand the magnitude of her breach more than any malicious intent, is what led to her permanent exile and a lifetime of regret. A stark lesson in the brutal price of confusing familial affection with institutional duty. 70 years after Marion Crawford's book landed like a bombshell, another intimate royal memoir would once again shake the foundations of the monarchy. Prince Harry's spare felt, in many ways, like a direct echo of Crawford's transgression, proving that while the technology and tone of tell-alls have evolved dramatically, the fundamental conflict at their core remains unchanged, a deeply personal struggle between an individual's desire to tell their own story and the institution's absolute demand for silence. Both Crawford and Harry were insiders who felt their narrative had been suppressed or misunderstood by the palace machine, and both turned to the global media to reclaim it, believing that public sympathy would side with the truth teller against the opaque institution. Yet the chasm between their accounts reveals just how much the nature of revelation has shifted. Crawford's The Little Princesses was, by today's standards, almost achingly innocent. Her disclosures were of scraped knees, saved ration coupons, and whispered secrets after lights out. Her tone was one of affectionate nostalgia, a gentle peek behind the curtain that shocked precisely because it was so mundane. Prince Harry's spare, by contrast, is a product of the modern therapeutic and media age. It is not a peek, but a full-blown demolition, armed with deeply personal accusations of family conflict, private betrayals, and raw psychological trauma. Where Crawford wrote about children's tantrums, Harry detailed heated arguments with his brother and father. Where she hinted at parental favoritism, he explicitly named it, framing it within a narrative of personal grievance and mental health struggle. The scale and depth of the disclosure are incomparable, moving from charming anecdotes to deeply painful, potentially relationship-ending accusations. The medium of delivery itself highlights a revolutionary change. Crawford worked in secret, passing handwritten pages to an American magazine editor in hushed hotel meetings, her words taking months to cross the Atlantic and find an audience. Harry's revelations were a meticulously orchestrated, multi-platform global event. Spare was launched with simultaneous television interviews, podcast promotions, and a relentless media blitz designed to dominate the news cycle for weeks. Where Crawford's act felt like a solitary, almost desperate gamble, Harry's was a professional media campaign, leveraging every modern tool to control the timing, messaging, and impact of his story. This shift turns a personal disclosure into a direct assault on the palace's media strategy, fought with the same weapons the institution uses to protect its image. Despite these vast differences in content and execution, the core tension they expose is eerily familiar. Both Crawford and Harry justified their actions with an almost identical plea. They were not betraying the family, but correcting the record. Crawford believed she was showing the world the warm, wonderful humanity of the royal she loved. Harry stated he wanted to reclaim his narrative from the ruthless and often deceptive British press, to explain his side of the story after years of being portrayed as a secondary character or a problem. Both saw themselves as truth-tellers breaking a toxic silence, while the institution viewed them as traitors violating a sacred trust for personal gain and public attention. This clash of perspectives reveals the monarchy's eternal, inflexible role. The institution's stability and mystique will always be prioritized over any single individual's truth, no matter how compelling or painful that truth may be. The consequences for both, though separated by decades, also follow a hauntingly similar pattern of brutal ostracization. The palace's playbook for dealing with a betrayer has remained remarkably consistent. For Crawford, it was social exile, a complete and permanent severing of ties that rendered her invisible. For Harry, it has been a very public stripping of titles, roles, and patronages, a formal demotion from working royal to distant relative. In both cases, the punishment was designed not just to penalize the individual, but to send an unambiguous message to every other current and future member of the household. See what happens to those who talk. The institution's survival depends on this unwavering enforcement of loyalty, proving that from the 1950s to the 2020s, the price for breaking the code remains a form of banishment from the kingdom they once called home. While the immediate aftermath of Marion Crawford's book was a storm of personal betrayal and public scandal, its most enduring impact was not on the royal family's inner circle, but on the world of publishing itself. The Little Princesses did far more than just sell millions of copies. It fundamentally redrew the map of royal biography, transforming it from a genre of respectful, distant portraiture into a bustling marketplace for intimate, behind-the-scenes revelation. Before Crawford, books about the monarchy were typically grand, authorized affairs, written by esteemed historians or court-approved biographers who focused on political achievements, diplomatic maneuvers, and the dignified public face of duty. These volumes were like official portraits, polished, formal, and designed to reinforce the mystique of the crown, not to dismantle it. They treated their subjects as historical figures, not as people who might argue over breakfast or have a favorite childhood toy. Crawford's book shattered that tradition utterly. She proved there was a massive, lucrative, and insatiable public appetite for the opposite, for the small, humanizing details that made royalty relatable. Publishers around the world suddenly saw the commercial potential, not in what a king did in Parliament, but in what he ate for toast. The success of The Little Princesses sent a clear and irresistible message to the industry. Access trumped authority, and intimacy sold better than impersonality. This opened the financial floodgates, creating a new class of royal author, the insider. Former secretaries, equerries, footmen, and even distant relatives now found themselves pursued by publishers offering checks for their memories, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. The very definition of what constituted a royal story had been permanently expanded to include the trivial and the domestic, because Crawford had shown that to the public, those were the most fascinating details of all. This new appetite inevitably demanded a new kind of journalism to feed it. The old guard of court correspondents, who operated with a sense of deference and an understanding of agreed-upon boundaries, began to find themselves competing with a more aggressive breed of investigative reporter. These new journalists understood that the real story wasn't always in the palace press release, but in the anecdotes of a disgruntled former employee, or the observations of a tradesperson who had worked inside the gates. The Crawford precedent created a market for leaked information and unofficial tidbits, encouraging a more adversarial relationship between the press and the palace. Reporters were no longer just chroniclers of royal events. They were now hunters of royal secrets, fueled by the knowledge that the public would reward a scoop detail about a prince's hobby or a queen's pet peeve far more than a perfectly recited speech about foreign policy. The genre itself began to split into two distinct paths. On one side, the Crawford model inspired a wave of warm, nostalgic, and ostensibly affectionate memoirs from those who had served the family, often focusing on childhoods and aiming to capture a sense of affectionate warmth, even as they traded in private moments. On the other, it paved the way for a much darker, more investigative form of royal biography that sought to expose the gaps between the public image and the private reality. Authors like Kitty Kelley, who would decades later write controversial, unauthorized biographies of the royals, owe a debt to Crawford's original breach. She demonstrated that there was an audience willing to believe that the official story was incomplete, and that a more complicated and often less flattering truth lay behind the palace gates. She made the royal family a subject of relentless psychological and personal scrutiny, a tradition that continues unabated to this day in countless documentaries, biographies, and magazine spreads that endlessly analyze every gesture and relationship within the firm. In this way, Marion Crawford, the Scottish governess who just wanted to tell a story, became the unlikely architect of the modern media's relationship with the monarchy. She inadvertently taught the public that they had a right to know not just what the royals did, but who they were, flaws and all. This created a permanent tension that the palace is still grappling with: the constant public demand for relatable, humanizing detail versus the institution's existential need to maintain a veil of mystery and elevate itself above the ordinary. Every time a television crew is granted access to a royal documentary or a biography promises unprecedented insight, or a newspaper runs a story about a royal family disagreement, it is operating in a world that Marion Crawford helped create. Her literary legacy is not a single book on a shelf, but the entire sprawling and often intrusive ecosystem of modern royal coverage that feeds a global audience's endless fascination with the humanness of its crowns. For the two young women at the very center of this storm, the betrayal was not a public scandal to be managed, but a deeply personal wound inflicted by someone they had loved without question. Princess Elizabeth, then 24 and only 4 years away from her ascension to the throne, likely experienced Crawford's actions as a profound and painful lesson in the solitary nature of her destiny. The nanny who had taught her grammar and comforted her through the anxieties of war had now commodified those very moments of vulnerability. For Elizabeth, whose entire life was being meticulously sculpted into a symbol of duty and discretion, this breach would have been the ultimate violation of that code. It reinforced a brutal, isolating truth: that even the most affectionate bonds formed within the royal sphere were ultimately conditional, and that her private life was not truly her own. This event almost certainly cemented her famous reserve, teaching her that total, unwavering trust was a luxury her position could never afford, hardening a protective shell that would define her reign for decades to come. Her younger sister, Margaret, just 20 years old and known for her fierce emotions and theatrical spirit, would have reacted with a more volatile sense of hurt and indignation. Where Elizabeth internalized lessons in stoicism, Margaret would have felt the sting of betrayal as a direct and personal affront. Crawford had been a confidante for her mischievous adventures, and a witness to her struggles living in the shadow of the heir. To see their private jokes and childhood squabbles laid bare for mass consumption would have felt like a profound intimacy betrayed. Margaret, who craved genuine connection and often chafed against the constraints of her role, may have taken this as a confirmation that those outside the immediate family could not be relied upon, potentially fueling the cynicism and difficulty with trust that would later mark her personal relationships. The betrayal might have felt like a rejection not just of her privacy, but of the unique, spirited girl she had been. The long-term impact on their ability to trust subordinates and staff cannot be overstated. This was not a distant news story. It was a domestic earthquake that happened in their own home, perpetrated by a woman who had helped raise them. It taught them that loyalty could be purchased, that affection could be leveraged, and that the most cherished memories of their childhood could be repackaged and sold. This event would have justified every instinct the palace old guard had to enforce distance and protocol between the royals and their household. For the rest of their lives, both sisters would have approached every new staff member, every potential confidante, with the ghost of Crawford in the room. It created a default position of caution, making the warm, familial dynamic they had enjoyed with their nanny an impossible relic of a more naive time, replaced by a necessary professional barrier that protected the institution, but undoubtedly cost them a certain kind of human connection. While no public record exists of either sister explicitly condemning Crawford, such an outward display of personal hurt would have been utterly against their training. Their actions spoke with unmistakable clarity. The absolute, unrelenting silence from the family was itself a powerful message of their personal dismay. They never mentioned her name publicly again. More tellingly, the way they later structured the upbringing of their own children reveals the lasting scar tissue from this event. Elizabeth, as queen, ensured her own children, Charles and Anne, were raised by a staff operating under far stricter, more formal protocols. The idea of a governess becoming a bosom friend, a playmate, and a surrogate sibling was unthinkable. The boundary between employer and employee was reinforced with concrete certainty. The intimate, somewhat normalizing influence Crawford had fought to provide was replaced by a system designed first and foremost to protect against another betrayal, prioritizing security over sentiment in the royal nursery. In the end, the greatest tragedy for the princesses may have been the loss of their own unvarnished history. Crawford's book froze their childhood in a single, commercialized narrative, told without their consent. The scraped knees, the silly jokes, the private fears, all of it now belonged to the public imagination, no longer just their own precious memories. Every anecdote from their youth would forever be filtered through the lens of Crawford's telling, a permanent, unauthorized footnote to their early lives. For Elizabeth, whose every word and memory would become a subject of historical scrutiny, this preemptive strike on her personal past was a unique form of theft. It robbed them of the quiet, personal ownership of their own story, ensuring that the world's perception of their childhood would always be viewed through the prism of their nanny's ultimate and unforgivable indiscretion. Of all the wounds inflicted by Marion Crawford's memoir, none cut deeper or festered more persistently than the profound personal hurt experienced by Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Her sense of betrayal was not that of a distant employer discovering a disloyal employee. It was the raw, intimate agony of a friend who had been blindsided by someone she had welcomed into her most private world. For nearly 2 decades, she had not treated Crawford as staff, but as a cherished member of their inner circle, a trusted confidante with whom she shared the unvarnished joys and anxieties of motherhood. The Queen Mother had discussed her daughters' educations, their personalities, their fears, and their futures with Crawford in a spirit of collaborative warmth. She had valued her opinions, relied on her discretion, and appreciated her unwavering support during the family's most vulnerable moments, from the shock of the abdication to the terror of the Blitz. In her eyes, their relationship was built on a foundation of mutual affection and implicit trust, a bond that transcended the typical boundaries of royal service. This history is what made the publication of The Little Princesses feel like such a vicious and personal violation. To see her private conversations about her children's characters, her parental worries, and her domestic life, now printed for millions to dissect over their breakfast tables, was an unspeakable humiliation. The Queen Mother was a woman whose entire public persona was meticulously crafted around grace, dignity, and an unshakable loyalty to the crown. Crawford's book pulled back the curtain on the carefully managed stage of her family life, exposing the ordinary and sometimes flawed humanity behind it. The revelation of her perceived favoritism towards Margaret or the king's occasional irritability were not just embarrassing details. They were fragments of her truth, shared in confidence with a friend, now being used as commercial entertainment. It transformed her cherished memories into public gossip, making a mockery of the intimacy she had so freely given. Her reaction was not one of theatrical anger, but of a cold, deeply wounded disappointment that would solidify into a permanent and bitter frost. The Queen Mother was a master of the unspoken rebuke, and her punishment was administered not through shouts or legal threats, but through a devastating and absolute silence. Every channel of communication was severed. The warm, familiar correspondence ceased. The invitations to private family gatherings, which had continued even after Crawford's retirement, were irrevocably withdrawn. It was a comprehensive social execution, a clear message that Marion Crawford no longer existed within the Queen Mother's universe. This silent treatment was far more powerful than any outburst. It communicated a contempt so profound that it did not even warrant discussion. This bitterness was not a fleeting emotion, but a permanent feature of the Queen Mother's character for the rest of her long life. It became a core tenet of her philosophy regarding the royal household, reinforcing her belief in impenetrable boundaries between the family and those who served them. The Crawford incident vindicated every instinct she had about the dangers of becoming too familiar with staff. It taught her that trust was a vulnerability to be managed, not a gift to be bestowed. This lesson would directly influence how she advised her daughter, the Queen, on managing her own household, leading to the stricter, more formal protocols that would later define the upbringing of Prince Charles and Princess Anne. The warm, almost familial dynamic she had once encouraged with Crawford was now seen as a dangerous liability, a gateway through which betrayal could enter. In Marion Crawford, the Queen Mother saw the ultimate cautionary tale, that no amount of shared history or affection could ever truly outweigh the corrupting allure of money and notoriety. a cynical lesson that would forever harden her heart and define her legacy as a guardian of the monarchy's most intimate secrets. The ripples from Marion Crawford's unprecedented betrayal did not remain confined to the pages of history or biography. They eventually washed onto the shores of popular culture, finding a dramatic and contentious new life on screen. The most prominent and widely discussed portrayal arrived decades later with Netflix's global phenomenon, The Crown, which dedicated a significant portion of its third season to the Crawford scandal. The show's interpretation, while compelling television, presents a fascinating and somewhat simplified version of events, one that has profoundly shaped modern public understanding of this 70-year-old drama for millions of viewers worldwide. In the series, Marion Crawford is portrayed not as a calculating opportunist, but as a tragically sympathetic figure, a kind-hearted woman gently pushed into the arms of publishers by a financially ambitious husband, and then cruelly cast aside by a cold and ungrateful institution. This characterization leans heavily into the narrative of a helpless victim of royal pomp, a perspective that generates audience empathy, but arguably glosses over the deeper nuances of her conscious choices and the profound cultural taboos she broke. The Crown excels at visualizing the stifling isolation Crawford faced in her post-palace life, depicting her alone in her cottage, ignored by former friends, and haunted by the very memories she sold. This poignant imagery powerfully communicates the human cost of her actions and the brutal efficiency of the royal family's silent treatment. However, the show's dramatization also condenses the complex, years-long pressure campaign from American publishers into a few key scenes, often centering the influence of her husband, George Butley, as the primary catalyst. This framing shifts significant blame away from Crawford's own agency, suggesting she was a pawn in a man's financial scheme rather than an independent woman who, after a long period of internal conflict, made an active decision. By softening her culpability, the series crafts a more palatable, tragic heroine arc that resonates with contemporary audiences, but may dilute the historical reality of her calculated transgression against the established code of her time. Beyond The Crown, the archetype of the royal tell-all, or the betrayed servant that Crawford pioneered, has become a staple trope in films, television series, and even novels dealing with aristocracy and power. Countless storylines feature the trusted nanny, the loyal valet, or the discreet secretary who is ultimately tempted by the allure of money or the desire for personal vindication, forever changing the lives of their wealthy employers. This trope almost always paints the institution, whether a royal family or a fictional elite dynasty, as a cold, unfeeling entity that consumes the loyalty of its staff without offering true reciprocity or respect. Crawford's story provided the blueprint for this narrative, establishing the core conflict between the individual's need for recognition and the powerful institution's demand for absolute silence. Her real-life experience gave writers a template for exploring themes of class, loyalty, and the moral price of insider knowledge, ensuring her legacy is embedded in the very DNA of how we storytell about the lives of the privileged and powerful. The enduring cultural fascination with Crawford's story speaks to a perpetual public ambivalence about royal privacy. On one hand, audiences devour the intimate details she first revealed and continue to consume every new leaked tidbit or unauthorized biography, proving the market she helped create is more voracious than ever. On the other hand, there often remains an underlying current of moral judgment against the tellers themselves, a societal sense that some bonds of trust should remain unbroken. Modern portrayals, like the one in The Crown, navigate this ambivalence by making the informant a relatable, sympathetic character, thereby allowing the audience to enjoy the revelation of secrets without feeling complicit in an act of betrayal. We can pity Crawford and condemn the palace's harshness, while simultaneously absorbing every delicious detail of the royal nursery, a comfortable dissonance that keeps her story perennially relevant. Ultimately, these cultural depictions have performed a significant act of historical reframing. For the generations who lived through the original scandal, Marion Crawford was largely the royal tattler, a figure of scorn who broke a sacred trust. For newer generations introduced to her through dramatic reenactments, she is more often seen as a flawed but sympathetic woman, a victim of a rigid class system and a heartless institution. This shift in perception demonstrates the immense power of popular media to reshape historical narrative, softening the edges of a complex moral failure into a more digestible tale of individual struggle against an impersonal system. While these portrayals have undoubtedly made the royal family's famed reticence and their severe punishment of leaks seem callous and out of touch to a modern audience, they also serve as a constant, dramatic reminder of the high-stakes contract between the crown and those who serve it. A contract first, and most famously, broken by a Scottish governess whose name became synonymous with the price of telling the truth. At the heart of the Crawford controversy lies a timeless ethical quandary, a delicate and often painful balancing act between two powerful forces: the right to a private life and the public's insatiable hunger to know. To fully grasp the weight of Marion Crawford's decision, we must step back from the simple labels of right or wrong and examine the complex philosophical ground on which this conflict plays out. The royal family, for all their palaces and crowns, are still human beings who laugh, cry, and argue behind closed doors. They possess the same fundamental desire for personal privacy that any family does the right to have childhood memories, private jokes, and parental struggles remain sacred and uncommodified. This isn't just about avoiding embarrassment. It's about preserving a space for genuine human connection, free from the distorting lens of public performance. From this perspective, Crawford's memoir was a profound violation, a theft of moments that were never hers to sell. The trust placed in her was the currency of that private world, and by spending it, she didn't just break a rule. She broke the very sanctity of the home she had helped to build. Yet, the argument for the public interest cannot be so easily dismissed. The British monarchy is not a private corporation. It is a publicly funded institution. Its very existence and power derived from the consent and support of the people. Its members live lives of immense privilege, but they also wield soft power, shape national identity, and serve as symbolic heads of state. This unique position creates a legitimate public stake in their character and fitness to lead. Can a nation be expected to pledge its allegiance to a completely opaque institution? Proponents of transparency argue that understanding the humanity behind the crown, the struggles, the triumphs, the very normalcy of their domestic lives fosters a deeper, more authentic connection between the sovereign and the subjects. Crawford's book, for all its faults, did something remarkable. It transformed the princesses from distant, porcelain figures on a balcony into relatable young girls who saved their pocket money and squabbled with their sisters. In an age of increasing media manipulation, her account offered an unfiltered, if unauthorized, glimpse that arguably made the monarchy more resilient by making it more human. The central ethical challenge, then, is locating that elusive line in the sand. Where does legitimate public interest end and prurient intrusion begin? Most would agree that the public has a right to know about a monarch's political judgments, their official duties, and the use of public funds. But do we have a right to know about a child's tantrum or a father's irritable breakfast mood? Crawford's revelations fell squarely into this latter, murkier category. They provided no insight into governance or policy. Instead, they dealt exclusively in the currency of intimate, domestic detail. This shifts the ethical justification from one of democratic accountability to one of entertainment and curiosity. The argument ceases to be about the public's need to know and becomes about their want to know. This is where Crawford's defense crumbles for many. She did not expose corruption or malfeasance. She satisfied a commercial market for personal trivia, leveraging her unique access not for a greater good, but for personal gain and recognition, however she may have rationalized it to herself. Furthermore, the power dynamic inherent in Crawford's position cannot be ignored. She was not a journalist holding power to account. She was a trusted insider, a caregiver, exploiting a relationship built on dependency and affection. The princesses were in no position to give consent for their childhoods to be published. They were the unwitting subjects of her narrative. This raises serious ethical questions about the exploitation of vulnerable individuals, even if those individuals are royal. A modern parallel might be a therapist or a live-in nanny publishing details about their clients or charges, a clear breach of professional ethics based on a fundamental imbalance of power. Crawford's actions were a betrayal of a specific trust, not an act of whistleblowing. She was not revealing information the public needed to hold the institution accountable. She was revealing information the public merely wanted for its entertainment value, and she did so from a position of privileged intimacy that made the betrayal all the more profound. Ultimately, the Crawford case forced a societal conversation about ownership. Who owns a family story? Does a servant, by virtue of their presence, earn a share of the narrative? Or do our most personal memories belong solely to us? The royal family's reaction, their utter and permanent silence, was a stark answer. Our private lives are not communal property. Their mystique, they argued, was not a deception, but a necessary shield, a barrier that allowed them to function as symbols while retaining some shred of a personal existence. In the decades since, the line has only blurred further. With the rise of social media and a confessional culture that demands constant accessibility. Yet the core ethical question Crawford posed remains unresolved. Her story serves as a permanent cautionary tale about the high cost of crossing that line, a reminder that some truths, however charming, are not ours to tell, and that the right to a private self is perhaps the most valuable currency in a world desperate to know everything. The Crawford affair scorched the very earth of trust that the royal household was built upon, forcing a complete and permanent architectural overhaul in the relationship between the sovereign and those who serve. For centuries, that bond had been governed by an unwritten code of honor, a genteel system of deference and paternalism where loyalty was assumed to be its own reward, reinforced by tradition and a shared sense of duty. Marion Crawford's betrayal exposed the fatal fragility of that system in the modern age, proving that ancient notions of honor were no match for the potent combination of financial temptation and a hungry media machine. The palace could no longer afford to operate on a handshake and a presumption of discretion. The personal had proven to be perilously political. In the wake of the scandal, the informal, almost familial dynamic that Crawford herself had enjoyed was systematically dismantled and replaced with a new, defensively formal paradigm designed to prevent such a breach from ever happening again. This new era was ushered in with the cold, unambiguous language of law. The gentleman's agreement was formally euthanized and replaced by the comprehensive, legally binding non-disclosure agreement. These documents became a non-negotiable prerequisite for employment, covering every role from the highest private secretary to the most junior member of the domestic staff. The NDAs were sprawling in their scope, imposing a lifetime vow of silence that extended far beyond an employee's tenure, legally forbidding them from ever disclosing anything seen or heard within the palace walls. The penalties for violation were designed to be catastrophic, involving staggering financial damages that would obliterate any profits from a tell-all and likely plunge the individual into lifelong debt. This transformed the concept of discretion from a moral obligation into a contractual one, enforceable not by social scorn alone, but by the full, terrifying force of the Crown's legal apparatus. The message was unmistakable. Loyalty was now mandatory, and betrayal would be met with financial annihilation. Alongside this legal fortress came a revolution in the very process of selecting who was allowed inside the gates. The old methods of hiring through aristocratic recommendation or personal connection were deemed hopelessly naive and vulnerable. In their place, the palace instituted a rigorous, multi-layered vetting process conducted with the assistance of external security professionals. Potential staff now faced intrusive background checks that scrutinized their financial history for any signs of debt or vulnerability to bribery, examined their personal relationships, and probed for any potential leverage a foreign agent or tabloid editor might exploit. The primary question was no longer merely, "Are you competent?" but "Are you impervious to temptation?" This sought to identify individuals whose discretion was an intrinsic part of their character, creating a staff filtered not just for skill, but for an almost monk-like imperviousness to the lures of the outside world. Trust was no longer given. It had to be pre-certified. Perhaps the most profound and culturally seismic shift occurred in the day-to-day atmosphere within the household. The warm and formal blurring of lines that Crawford represented, the governess as playmate, confidante, and surrogate family member, was identified as a critical vulnerability and ruthlessly excised. A new professional distance was consciously cultivated and enforced. Staff were gently but firmly discouraged from forming the deep, personal bonds that could lead to a sense of ownership over private moments. The nursery, once a realm of shared laughter and secrets, became a more structured, professional environment. While nannies and governesses were still expected to be caring and kind, the boundary between employee and family was reinforced with unambiguous clarity. The royals themselves, deeply scarred by the personal nature of Crawford's betrayal, became more guarded, understanding that even the most affectionate relationships with staff carried an inherent risk. This cultural recalibration prioritized the security of the institution over the warmth of personal connection, fundamentally altering the human experience of working within the palace walls. This new hardened philosophy extended its reach to shape the childhoods of the next generation of royals. The relatively normalizing outings Crawford had championed, the trips on the London Underground, the mingling with other children in the Girl Guides, were deemed an unacceptable security risk and were abruptly terminated. The world of young princes and princesses became increasingly insular, carefully curated within the high walls and guarded gates of Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and Balmoral. Their interactions with the outside world were heavily managed by an expanding press office, which itself grew in power and influence as the primary gatekeeper of the royal image. This office's mission evolved from simply announcing engagements to actively manufacturing a controlled narrative, providing the public with sanitized, approved glimpses of royal life to satisfy curiosity without surrendering true privacy. The lesson of Crawford was clear. Access was a threat to be managed, not a privilege to be shared, and the right to a childhood unobserved became a casualty in the ongoing war to protect the mystique of the monarchy. Yet the echoes of her choice have proven impossible to silence, reverberating through the decades with undiminished force. Marion Crawford's story endures not merely as a historical footnote, but as the foundational cautionary tale for the modern age of celebrity and revelation. She stands at the very crossroads of loyalty and betrayal, of privacy and exposure, a permanent symbol of the immense personal cost that comes with telling a truth that is not yours to tell. Her memoir did far more than share charming anecdotes. It fundamentally renegotiated the ancient, unwritten contract between the observer and the observed, proving that in the right hands, or the wrong ones, the most intimate details could become the most valuable commodity. Her legacy is a deeply paradoxical one, a double-edged sword that continues to cut both ways. On one hand, she is the original sinner against the royal code of omerta, the woman whose actions justified a fortress mentality that would make royal childhoods thereafter more isolated, more guarded, and less free. She is the reason the palace doors slammed shut even tighter, the justification for a lifetime of legalistic silence imposed upon every future employee. Yet on the other hand, she is the unlikely liberator of public perception, the first to argue, however imperfectly, that the humanity behind the icon is worth knowing. She pioneered the idea that to understand the ruler, we might need to understand the child they once were, that the making of a queen could be found in the small moments of an ordinary upbringing. In this sense, she paved the way for a more relatable, psychologically complex understanding of monarchy, even as the institution fought desperately against that very exposure. The price she paid, however, serves as the story's most chilling and enduring lesson. Marion Crawford gained a fortune and a fleeting notoriety, but she lost everything that had given her life meaning, her unique place in history, the affection of the family she adored, and her own sense of self as a loyal and discreet woman. She became a ghost in her own life, haunting the outskirts of the world she had betrayed, a living monument to the consequences of broken trust. Her profound isolation and regret are the dark heart of this tale, a stark reminder that some doors once opened can never be closed again, and that some bonds once severed can never be repaired. Her life after the book stands as a powerful deterrent, a real-world example of the social and personal annihilation that awaits those who break the sacred code of the inner circle. Ultimately, the questions Crawford's story forces us to confront are more relevant today than ever before. In an era of social media oversharing, relentless paparazzi pursuit, and a voracious 24-hour news cycle, the battle lines between public interest and private life are constantly being redrawn. Her saga asks us where that line should truly be drawn. Do we have a right to the childhood secrets of our future leaders? Does a lifetime of public service demand the forfeiture of all personal privacy? And at what point does our curiosity become a form of exploitation, a consumption of another's humanity for our own entertainment? Marion Crawford's memoir, for all its seeming innocence, tapped into this deep and often uncomfortable public appetite, an appetite that has only grown and become more demanding in the decades since. Her story, therefore, is not a closed chapter, but a living conversation. It is the conversation that happens every time a new royal biography hits the shelves, every time a former aide gives a tell-all interview, every time we click on a headline promising a secret glimpse behind the palace gates. She established the blueprint, and we, the public, have been wrestling with the ethical consequences ever since. The lonely figure of Marion Crawford, forever looking back at a world from which she was exiled, remains the ultimate symbol of this tension, a cautionary tale not just for potential whistleblowers, but for all of us who consume the stories they tell. She reminds us that every revealed secret has a human cost, and that the price of truth is often paid not by the one who tells it, but by those whose truth is told.